Welcome to Apocalypse Now, the podcast where we dive into some of the most devastating environmental disasters and explore how we can prevent them from happening again. I'm Holly Stower. I'm an environmental researcher and advisor who's worked with big name companies to develop sustainable solutions and solve their environmental challenges. And I've put together some juicy environmental stories, which I'll dissect, examining what happened, why it happened, who is responsible, and the consequences for the people and the planet. Then in the following episode, we'll shift from disaster to solution, the apocalypse to the now, exploring how solutions in technology and society can help rewrite the story and prevent the disasters ever happening again. So today I'm talking about the Aberfan disaster. It's a tragedy that happened in the 60s in Wales, United Kingdom. And Aberfan wasn't a natural disaster. It was very much a man-made catastrophe, one which forced the British public to ask who knew, who failed to act, and how could this even happen? So let's get into it. On the morning of October 21st, 1966, at 9:15 a.m., it was a windless and sunny day in the Welsh mining town of Aberfan. It had rained really heavily for the past few weeks, which isn't unusual for Wales, but yes, very contextual in this story. That morning, the 240 children of the Pantglas Junior School had just begun their lessons at 9 a.m. And due to the upcoming midterm break, it was a half day as well that day. But then at just 9:15, 15 minutes after classes began, it happened. First, a booming sound like thunder, then a bang. Children came in running and screaming into the secondary school hall. The classroom in the furthest corner of the school collapsed, and the roof had started to collapse as well. The head teacher at the time, Kenneth Davis, climbed on top of the rubble in the doorway and saw the houses in the road opposite had disappeared, and only the roof stood in the junior school. Howard Rees, who was a pupil making his way to the secondary school, described seeing a big black wave higher than the houses heading straight towards him. And he could see trees in this black flow hurtling towards him, moving at speed. I can't imagine how terrifying that would be. So an estimated 40,000 cubic meters of mining waste, which is thick slurry, had come rushing down the mountain and swept with this jet-like roar, which was the booming sound that you heard at the beginning. The massive force of this landslide overwhelmed 2 farm cottages, killing their occupants. It crossed the disused canal and went over the railway embankment. It engulfed and destroyed the entire junior school, as well as 18 houses, and damaged the secondary school, as well as houses in the village before the flow ceased. Although hit by flying debris, the boy, Howard Rees, making his way to school, survived. But unfortunately, he witnessed 3 of his school friends killed while sitting on a wall on one of the houses crushed by the debris. And that image of 3 kids just sitting on a wall just really reminds me of just being in primary school and waiting for your friends to walk together. I can't imagine. It must have been so sad. And the head teacher of the secondary school, Kenneth Davis, he found himself at the very edge of the heap of fallen debris, which was about 20 to 30 feet high. And he led staff members to begin evacuating the secondary school, with pupils gathering at the front for a roll call. However, this was then disrupted as a second rush of dirty water started to flood the town, bringing more waste material. Although this was far less dramatic than the initial landslide, it still disrupted proceedings. So teachers continued to guide and sometimes carry children away from the danger as water continued to pour down the hill from newly burst water pipes. But the town quickly mobilized. Emergency workers, volunteers, policemen, firemen, and other volunteers quickly joined the effort to try and save the children. And a part which I think is really sad is some of the fathers of the children previously protected from the landslide because they were in the mine, then ended up having to desperately try and dig out their own children from the rubble, from the landslide. People feared that mechanical machinery would crush those buried in the rubble, so people were literally using their bare hands to remove the rubble. So one of those children was Jeff Edwards. He was an 8-year-old boy with really bright white hair. Jeff was pinned with a desk against his stomach, and that enabled this pocket of air, which thankfully kept him alive. Rescuers were able to spot his bright white hair at 11:15 and pulled him out of the rubble after about 2 hours of being trapped. But Jeff was sadly the last child to be rescued alive. The sheer amount of rubble meant it took weeks to recover all of the bodies. And that day, 116 children, 25 adults were killed, wiping out half of the town's youth in just minutes. The landslide also destroyed farmhouses, cottages, and part of the secondary school. And it was a devastating tragedy. I can't imagine half the kids in one town being killed in one go. Yeah, it was an awful, awful tragedy, and one that could have been prevented. So, what happened? So, to understand Aberfan, you really need to understand the history of mining in the UK, as well as some of the villages in the south of Wales. As for coal mining has a strong history in the UK. Since the 19th century, coal mining increased significantly to fuel the Industrial Revolution as fuel for steam engines. Coal was also used for domestic heating due to its low cost and high availability. By 1841, around 216,000 people were employed in coal mines, including women, children. Conditions were awful. They were working about 11 to 12 hours a day, dark and dangerous conditions for a smaller wage than the women, and the children were working for a far smaller wage than the men. Early UK coal mining has also had its fair share of disasters. In 1838, at the Husker coal mine near Barnsley, the north of England, a stream overflowed into the ventilation drift after huge thunderstorms. This caused the death of 26 children aged between 8 and 12. This led to one of the first regulations around the mining industry, the Mines Act of 1842, which banned women from working in the mines and set a minimum age limit of 10 for boys in the mine, but introduced no safety laws. So back to coal production in the UK. So coal production really peaked in 1913, but until the 1960s, coal was still the main source of energy production as imported oil started to come cheaper. So between the 1950s and the 1960s, around 100 northeast coal mines were actually closed and production continued to decline. In the 1960s, mining was still a linchpin industry for many, many towns and villages. Mines provided jobs, which created small economies, which these towns relied on, including many across the South Welsh valleys. Mining still remained really dangerous work, but people really assumed this was for the miners and not for their families. So how exactly did Aberfan happen? So when you dig a mine, there is a lot of earth that you displace. This is topsoil, overburden, waste rock, tailings. This excavated earth needs to go somewhere. This earth is often called mining spoil, but I'll refer to it as tip waste for simplicity. So in surface mining, commonly called strip mining for coal and other underground deposits, earth materials are removed to expose the target deposits, and these are piled up alongside the excavation site. commonly a strip mining pit in what's called spoil banks. So you're digging all of this stuff out, needs to go somewhere. This tip waste is usually deposited close to the mine. If you're going to be further away from the mine, that's a lot more energy, money in transportation costs. It's kind of why there are a lot of fake hills in the north of England as well as Wales from just these big mining pits that have been built up and nature has taken back over time. So in Aberfan, the area was called the Merthyr Vale Colliery. This area included the sort of coal mine at Aberfan, the village of Aberfan. This was started in 1869, and the first coal was produced in 1875. So by 1916, the colliery, I'm going to stop saying colliery and change it to coal mine because I can't say it well. The coal mine had run out of space to tip the waste on the valley floor and began tipping on the mountainside above the village of Aberfan. A total of 7 tips were constructed on the hillside overlooking Aberfan. These tips contained about 2.1 million cubic meters of tailings, and by 1966, only one of these tips were in use. This was tip 7, and this tip was directly above the Aberfan village. So it wasn't like this was a big shock. 3 slips had actually happened before, and the whole tip was sited above the mountain spring. The whole tip was sited above a mountain spring, meaning it risked becoming liquid and slipping. So you have this big mountain of tip waste that was literally underneath a little spring river. And yes, no one saw a big, any concern with that. So, that very same watercourse had also caused earlier failures, so tip failures. I'll go into it. So there had been heavy rain for weeks in the lead up to the disaster. However, this isn't uncommon for Aberfan, but as the tip was built over this natural spring, water was rising from below and had no natural drainage. So this meant that the tip saturated. This elevated the pore pressure, meaning the amount of water in air spaces in the tip pushed the soil particles apart, separating the particles and making the material behave more like a liquid than a solid. This reduces the overall strength of the lower layers. The tip waste was also loosely tipped, so was sort of settled unevenly. The tip was also on a steep slope to begin with, providing an uneven profile. So you have this liquefied waste stream underneath, already on a slope with uneven layers. Yes, very, 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 very dangerous. I describe it like this, it seems obvious. So when a small slip in material occurred, the disturbance caused the saturated fine material of the tip to liquefy and then start to flow down the mountain. So there was warnings that this might happen even closer to the disaster happening. The night before the disaster, the tip had actually subsided by about 9 to 12 inches. This indicated that the internal layers were weakening and compacting. This is was known at the time as a precursor to tip failure. So the morning of October 21st, 1966, that morning workers arrived to find that tip had dropped by about 10 feet, indicating the tip had turned liquid. But no phone lines were working that day. So workers drove down to warn bosses of the danger, but they were too late. So how could this happen? As I mentioned briefly earlier, throughout this time, there were no UK regulations governing the mine and quarry waste tips and spoil heaps. The people in charge were the National Coal Board, or the NCB. The NCB was the statutory industry created to run all UK the nationalised coal industry of the UK. They had no tipping policy that would enforce the need for appropriate design or management of these tips. So locals had raised repeated concerns about the tip, but these were ignored. With the 3 previous slips having occurred, in addition to a large failure of tip 4 in 1944. But as no one was injured, this wasn't even reported. Then again, in 1963, just 3 years prior to Aberfan, a letter was sent by waterworks engineer D.C.W. Jones to his colleague T. Ritchie, the district public works superintendent. The letter says, "Councillor, Miss Williams has advised me the NCB appear to be taking slurries similar to that which was deposited and gave so much trouble at the quarry at Merthyr Vale up on the existing tip at the rear of Pantglas schools. If this is a true statement of the position, then I regard it as extremely serious, as the slurry is so fluid and the gradient so steep that it could not possibly stay in position in the wintertime or during periods of heavy rain." Before writing to the NCB, I thought it'd be advisable if you called to see the position for yourself, and I will leave it to you to decide whether you call at the Merthyr Vale colliery to see the manager before you pay a visit. If you do this, it may be a good thing, as the manager would probably decide to go with you and show you exactly what you're doing. So, strong warnings. A month later, he penned a letter to D. Roberts, the area chief mechanical engineer for the NCB, saying, "You are no doubt well aware of the tips at Merthyr Vale Tower above the Pangloss area, and if they were to move, a very serious position would accrue." When Mr. Roberts replied 5 months later, it did acknowledge the risk posed by the tips, but said that he could not come up with a solution. "A satisfactory and suitable place, other than the tip, to dispose of the tailings eludes me at the moment and causes me great concern." In March that year, Mr. Roberts indicated that they would like to change the site for the tipping space away from tip 7, but failed to take any action. So prior to Aberfan, the NCB had dealt with other slips and landslides in the Aberfan and wider area. And so the NCB had developed experience with expertise on tip stability, yet failed to act swiftly on Aberfan. Other contributory factors included the numerous springs which covered the Aberfan hillside, and no effort was made to enclose these springs that would eventually be buried underneath the tips. So, some big F-ups. We can identify already some faults here. And after the British public was shocked, dismayed, upset, and then a huge tribunal. So the tribunal was a formal inquiry set up immediately after the disaster to investigate what went wrong, who was responsible, and how it can be avoided again. The tribunal was the largest tribunal in British history. It took 76 days. The tribunal included 136 witnesses, including engineers, geologists, mining experts, local residents, government officials, National Coal Board employees, and the tip workers. So following the tribunal, the inquiry concluded that the essential causes of the disaster were the inappropriate placement, tipping method, and ineffective management, coupled with the site conditions, all exacerbated by heavy rainfall. The tribunal placed blame entirely on the National Coal Board, citing their complete lack of policy on pit management, and were responsible for placing tip 7 on a known spring despite warnings it could cause instability, failing to engineer or inspect the tip, failing to respond to multiple warnings from the local authorities, residents, and tip workers, and allowing continued tipping on an unstable site. The tribunal also found that there was a culture of indifference, denial within the NCB, and decisions were made by individuals with no technical background in geology or soil mechanics, and record keeping and internal communications was disorganized at best or non-existent. A nice quote from the tribunal report says, "The Aberfan disaster is a terrifying tale, bungling ineptitude by many men charged with the task for which they were totally unfitted, of failure to heed clear warnings as a total lack of direction from above." However, no one was prosecuted and no one was fired. And the handling of the aftermath by the National Coal Board was frankly outrageous and insensitive. So immediately after the disaster, without investigation, the chairman, this is before the tribunal, the chairman of the National Coal Board, Alfred Lord Robbins, blamed the unknown spring underneath the tip, which was challenged by the Aberfan residents who had known the spring was there, alerted the National Coal Board, and the spring was there and had existed on public ordnance survey maps, which the National Coal Board had access to. However, that did not stop Lord Robbins and the National Coal Board wasting up to 76 days of the inquiry by not admitting fault. The National Coal Board chairman at the time, Lord Robbins, really is the central bad dude of this whole story in the aftermath. He has an interesting character arc, and we'll get to that. But wow. Yeah, he needed a public relations team. So in addition to the initial deflection of this unknown spring, the day after Aberfan, Lord Robbins decided instead not to attend the disaster, but to attend an event where he was installed as the Chancellor of the University of Surrey, posing smiling for photos instead of visiting Aberfan. So high levels of insensitivity the day after. Then 1997, some more information was released in 1997. These were the Aberfan papers. This has followed a Freedom of Information request, which revealed the depths of evasion of responsibility by the National Coal Board and Lord Robbins. Initially viewed as a gallant act after the tribunal concluded that the National Coal Board was at fault, Lord Robbins offered to resign. But this was nothing more than a publicity stunt. Robbins had actually been given the report 10 days prior to the publication and immediately went to lobbying support for himself. He went to all his friends in government, convinced those government members that he was the only person who could reduce costs in coal production whilst quelling strikes. As I said prior, this was a really tumultuous time in UK history regarding coal mining, significant strikes, the decline of the industry. The government were very, very worried about this. So he went to the government, said he was the only guy for the job. I'm the only one that can quell these strikes. But he then went to draft his resignation letter. At the same time, he also drafted the resignation letter from the Minister of Transport, Richard Marsh. This enabled Robbins to shift the blame away from himself and his board members and down the rung to the charge hands of the workers of the tip. So he blamed the people that were working on the tip, these fathers of the kids that got buried by the rubble, the fathers of the kids that had told the National Coal Board, told the government time and time again that this was dangerous. He was blaming those people. So with the National Coal Board at fault, there had to be some repatriations. And the National Coal Board and the government and the charity commission then bungled this up. They further traumatized families. The National Coal Board paid only £500 compensation, which is about £12,000 in today's money for each dead child. It called this a generous offer. having previously offered just 10% of that at £50, which would be about £1,200 today. The Charity Commission intervened, preventing flat payments to families. So it tried to prevent these funds being paid out. The community wanted to build a memorial arch years after the disaster to begin to process, to mourn. A very normal response and a good use of funding that the NCB were required to pay for. Yet the Charity Commission blocked this, demanding that each case should be reviewed to ascertain whether the parents had been close to their children and were thus likely to be surviving mentally. So after being failed by the government, the National Coal Board, the Charity Commission are intervening, saying that each case should be reviewed to work out whether the parents were actually close to their children that died. Classy, very, very classy. The commission then remained silent when the government raided the funds to remove the tip. So although the National Coal Board owned the tip and the tip violated their own criteria for safety, the National Coal Board were not liable to pay for the cleanup. And the Labour government under Harold Wilson ended up raiding this disaster fund that the National Coal Board had to pay out in 1968 to pay for the removal of Aberfan. This money that was initially assigned to grieving families who had to bury their children was used to clear up the National Coal Board's mistake. Initially, the government wanted £350,000. It was then reduced to £150,000. And obviously there was outrage, as rightly there should be. The National Coal Board then refused to appoint a cheaper contractor who would sell the coal cleared, as the sale of the coal would undercut the National Coal Board's price. Oh, yeah. National Coal Board, really good handling here. So the aftermath was managed with as much grace and care and sensitivity as the mismanagement which actually led to Aberfan. Perhaps even more. It was heinous, deflective corporate mismanagement. It's so unbelievably selfish. As well, the legal frameworks were already in place in 1966 for manslaughter. So why weren't those responsible held responsible? The Queen was also criticised for her visit to Aberfan, arriving 8 days after the disaster, while the Prime Minister and Prince Philip and even Lord Robbins of the National Coal Board visited within the first 2 days. This was perceived by the community, public and press as sort of a perceived lack of empathy. And the Queen's desire was reportedly due to not distract rescue efforts, which you kind of understand in context. And although not proven, many palace insiders have described her delay as one of the biggest regrets of her life. And she's since returned 3 more times during her reign. So, in conclusion, with the proven corporate awful mismanagement from the National Coal Board, utter lack of accountability, sensitivity in the aftermath from corporate, government, regal figureheads, and the utterly tragic loss of life, this is one of the worst environmental disasters in British history. The children who died became Aberfan's lost generation, and the community still manage the scars to this day. And in what is an entirely preventable and massively tragic event. So in the next episode, I'll shift from disaster to solutions, exploring the technologies, policies, and people that are working to make sure that history doesn't repeat itself. But unfortunately, these events still happen across the world. And I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, whether it's feedback on the episode, questions you'd like answered, or even personal experiences related to the topic. Have you or your community lived through an environmental disaster? What does prevention mean to you? So you can reach out to me on Instagram at Apocalypse Nope, or by leaving a comment on wherever you're listening to this from. I will leave some links to references in the show notes, as well as all the sources I've used for these 2 episodes. But don't forget to subscribe, share, leave a review. Helps more people find the show and join the conversation. I'm Holly Stower. This is Apocalypse Now. And remember, stopping the apocalypse starts with understanding where it begins.